Hi guys, how are you today? After a hard-working day, let's relax with this journey through history. If you're as excited as we are to dive into this captivating journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more adventures into the past. Let's uncover the mysteries of the Victorian eras together. Hit that bell icon too, so you're always first in line for the next historical adventure. So settle in, fluff your pillow, maybe light a candle. Let's dim the lights and take a deep, relaxing breath. In the stillness of the past, there was a time when a woman's life was often confined to the quiet corners of the home. She moved through her days with a sense of duty, her thoughts rarely her own, as the world outside the walls remained distant, almost unreachable. At the heart of Victorian society stood the idea that a woman's place was within the domestic sphere. It was a life defined not by the ambitions she might have carried, but by the tasks that filled her hours, caring for the children, maintaining the household, and supporting the figure of her husband. In this world, the woman was expected to be a presence of comfort, but not one of outward influence. As the years passed, the lives of these women remained mostly unchanged. Their existence, though not harsh in the way one might think of hardship, was nonetheless filled with limitations. Economic power rested solely in the hands of their husbands. The concept of independence, as it might have been understood by others, was not a reality for them. Their daily activities, quiet as they were, held no space for self-determination. Instead, they were dependent on the man who held the financial reins. This idea of dependence was not sudden. It had been the structure for generations. With marriage, a woman's identity became entwined with her husband's. Her financial resources, her ability to make decisions, even her legal standing, all were overshadowed by the authority of her husband. A woman's rights were as limited as the narrow walls of her domestic realm. In the lives of these women, there were often glimpses of desires beyond the walls. Some women might have looked out of the window, imagining a life of more, perhaps one of learning or personal ambition. But these thoughts were fleeting, soft, and almost unspoken. The reality was clear. Social mobility was a distant dream. To rise in status, one would need a marriage, a connection to a man of higher standing, for women of the Victorian age could not climb the ladder of society alone. Yet, as history quietly unravels, it becomes apparent that the limitations of this era are not the story of hardship in the way one might expect. Rather, they are the story of quiet lives shaped by invisible forces. The women of the Victorian era were not forced to endure visible battles, but instead they lived within the constraints of a system that had been in place for centuries. They carried on with their days without complaint or outward resistance, navigating a world that seemed unchangeable. Reflecting on their lives from our place in history, we come to understand that this life was not one of unspoken happiness, but rather a kind of silent acceptance. The women of this time were not marked by dramatic change, but by a slow, gentle rhythm of existence, a rhythm that we now see as part of a much larger narrative of societal structure. As we look back on this time, we do so not with a sense of urgency or conflict, but with a quiet contemplation. The Victorian wife, who lived through these times, existed in a world much different from our own, yet in many ways their lives, calm, slow, and deeply rooted in their role, remain a quiet reflection of the past. In the quiet of a Victorian home, the work of a wife unfolded in soft rhythms, each task, whether tending to the hearth or managing the household, carried out with measured care. Yet, behind these unspoken routines, there was another, more subtle rhythm at play, one that governed her life in a way that was not immediately visible, but was deeply felt. It was the rhythm of economic dependence, a system that shaped every decision, every movement, every thought. The marriage contract in Victorian society carried with it not just promises of companionship, but also a strict division of power. When a woman married, she did not just take on the title of wife. She surrendered many aspects of her own agency, her finances, her property, even her legal identity. All of these became intertwined with her husband's. Under the legal doctrine of coverture, a married woman's rights were essentially erased. The husband assumed full control over any assets she might bring into the marriage, and even over those that were acquired during their union. The wife's world, though rich in its own way, was thus defined by the absence of control. For a woman in this time, the notion of financial autonomy was almost entirely foreign. Whether she came from wealth or poverty, the moment she married, she became financially dependent on her husband, even if he did not choose to exert that power overtly. Her decisions about spending, saving, or managing resources were subject to his will. This arrangement was not considered oppressive, but simply a natural part of life, an accepted norm that rarely called into question. In many ways, this lack of control was cloaked in the soft veneer of domestic duty. The wife's labor within the home was seen as a contribution to the household, yet it remained unpaid and unseen. The idea that she should receive compensation for her work never truly existed in the minds of most. Her role was one of service, to her husband, to her children, and to society. Her tasks, however demanding, were not considered work in the economic sense. They were extensions of her identity as a wife and mother, as if those roles alone were sufficient to justify her place in the world. Though she might have wanted to make purchases for the house, or perhaps save money for herself, there was no formal system in which her desires could take precedence. If she had any independent funds, they would often be tightly managed, for the sake of family interests. She could not simply go to a bank and withdraw money for herself, for even the most basic financial transactions were subject to her husband's oversight. The funds she received for the household often passed through his hands before they ever reached hers. In this quiet world, the notion of economic dependence went unnoticed by many. The wife herself, though fully aware of the limits on her freedom, accepted these boundaries without resistance. It was not so much that she was unaware of her situation. Rather, it was a reality that she learned to navigate as best she could. The thought of ever challenging the structure was far too distant to entertain. It was simply a part of life, as ingrained in the Victorian world as the walls of the home she maintained. Yet there were moments, though rare, when a wife might experience the weight of her circumstances. Perhaps she wished to purchase a new set of curtains, or invest in a book she'd long desired to read, but the decision to do so required her husband's approval. The funds for such purchases, whether from his income or their combined savings, were never fully hers to spend. Even her thoughts about money were shaped by the understanding that it was never fully within her control. The role she played was not one of a partner in the modern sense, but of an auxiliary to her husband's authority. This quiet dependency was a far-reaching force, woven into every moment of daily life. A wife may have asked her husband for a small amount of money to buy fabric for new clothes, but in doing so, she had to account for every penny. The questions would be raised, not by her, but by him, questioning the necessity of the purchase, the appropriateness of the fabric, and whether it fit into the family budget. She was not free to make choices on her own terms. The husband's financial control was not only a practical matter, but a deeply embedded social expectation. In a time when personal wealth was the key to independence, this lack of control over financial matters placed women in an incredibly vulnerable position. Yet, the vulnerability was rarely addressed by the society of the time. Women were taught that their value was not in their ability to manage wealth, but in their ability to create a comfortable, nurturing environment. This belief was so deeply entrenched in the fabric of society that it was rarely questioned, even by women themselves. While some women were fortunate enough to have husbands who managed money reasonably, others found themselves at the mercy of their husband's financial mismanagement or lack of foresight. In such cases, the wife's well-being was entirely dependent on the whims of her husband's decisions. The lack of a financial safety net meant that even small missteps in financial planning could have significant consequences. The wife, who might have spent years carefully managing the household and saving for a rainy day, could suddenly find herself penniless if her husband made an imprudent investment or lost his job. One might imagine a situation where a woman's financial independence could have made all the difference. If she had earned her own wage, or been able to control her own savings, perhaps the dynamic within her household would have shifted. But for the majority of Victorian wives, these scenarios remained purely hypothetical. The reality was that their lives were often as dictated by the ebb and flow of their husband's financial decisions as they were by the needs of the family. Despite these constraints, the Victorian wife was still expected to be the heart of the home. Her labour was integral to the household, even if it went unnoticed by those outside the family. While her husband earned the money, she spent her days managing the domestic sphere, cooking, cleaning, caring for the children. In many cases, the wife was expected to take on these responsibilities with little expectation of rest or recognition. The economic burden that fell upon her was not just financial, but emotional. The weight of managing a home with limited resources and no control over financial decisions was often an invisible hardship that wore away at the spirit. Yet, despite the absence of financial freedom, there was still a sense of pride in the work of the wife. She could take comfort in the beauty of a well-kept home, the health of her children, and the satisfaction of her husband's contentment. Though her life was not her own to shape, she found fulfillment in small moments. The fruits of her labor, though often unnoticed by others, were what gave her a sense of purpose within the narrow world she inhabited. As the years passed, the notion of financial independence remained distant for most Victorian women. The slow changes that would later come, as women began to gain access to education, the workforce, and eventually the vote, seemed impossibly far off. In the quiet of the Victorian home, the economic dependence of wives remained a steady rhythm, unchallenged and unremarked upon by many. In looking back, we find that this dependence was not just an economic arrangement, it was a cultural framework that shaped the lives of women for generations. It was the world they lived in, one of gentle restriction, where the boundaries of their lives were set not by their desires, but by the system that held them in place. They moved through their days with a calmness that masked the hidden struggles they faced. It was a life of quiet sacrifice, where the hope for something more was often nothing more than a whispered thought, lost in the rustling of domestic life. As we reflect on this period, we do so not with an emotional outcry, but with a quiet understanding of how these invisible forces shaped the lives of countless women. Their struggle for control, though never loudly voiced, is nonetheless a profound chapter in the slow march toward equality and self-determination. In the soft quiet of the Victorian world, the life of a woman unfolded not in sweeping moments of change, but in the gradual, almost imperceptible rhythm of daily duties and responsibilities. Her world, though rich with small joys and comforts, was framed by invisible walls that few could see but all felt. These walls, though not made of stone, were no less confining. They were the social structures that defined who a woman could be, where she could go, and what she could achieve. Social mobility, the ability to move upward in society, was not a right available to most Victorian women. It was, in fact, a distant dream, barely within reach. A woman's life, in many ways, was tied to the fortunes of the man she married. This was true for all women, regardless of their background. Whether she was born into a wealthy family or one of humble means, her path in life was often determined by her husband's status and wealth. In a society that placed great value on social rank, a woman's own social mobility was tied directly to the man who took her as his wife. This system, though quietly accepted, placed a subtle and heavy weight upon the shoulders of Victorian women, making them the quiet spectators of a world in which they were given little power to change their circumstances. The system was simple. A woman could rise in society only by marrying a man of higher social standing. A woman from a lower-class background might hope, with great expectation, to marry a man of wealth or influence, thus lifting her from the confines of her family's station. This, however, was no easy task. Marriage, in this sense, became more than a partnership of love and companionship. It was a practical transaction, a means by which a woman could secure not only her place in society, but her survival. The prospect of marrying upwards in the social hierarchy was often the only opportunity a woman had to alter her place in the world. But even this was not a guarantee. The social structure of the time was rigid and unyielding, and it was not simply enough for a woman to marry well. A marriage that promised upward mobility required more than just a husband of means. It required approval from society, from family, and even from her own sense of self. The ideal of the Victorian woman was not one of independence but of support. She was meant to complement her husband's life, not forge her own path. Even when she married a man of higher standing, her role remained circumscribed by her place within the home, within the family. As society placed this heavy emphasis on marriage as the primary vehicle for social mobility, it also dictated that a woman's potential for upward movement was limited. The woman, once married, was no longer viewed as an independent entity with her own aspirations and desires. Her identity, her social standing was subsumed into her husband's. Her ambitions were no longer hers to pursue. She was expected to be a support, a caretaker, a mother, all roles that, while fulfilling in their own right, were not seen as avenues for personal growth or ambition. This system of limited mobility was particularly stark for women of the lower classes. For these women, marriage was often their only escape from poverty or obscurity. But even in this, the escape was illusory. The reality was that their marriage prospects were often limited by the very same social class they were born into. A woman from a poor family was unlikely to catch the eye of a man from a higher social rank. The expectations of the time were clear. A woman's worth was largely defined by her family's status and her ability to marry well. Even the most capable or ambitious woman was often relegated to a life of quiet stagnation, dependent upon the fortune of those around her. Women of the upper classes, while seemingly afforded more opportunities, were not free from these constraints. Their lives too were shaped by the same societal expectations. Their social mobility was just as limited, though perhaps less visibly so. While they might enjoy a certain level of comfort and security, their potential for growth was still largely defined by the roles they were expected to fill within the home. Their lives were shaped by the expectations of family and society. And even the most talented or driven woman found that her options for advancement outside the domestic sphere were minimal. The world of art, literature, or politics, those realms where social mobility and personal achievement could be attained, were often closed off to them. For women of the middle class, the situation was more complex. They were not bound by the extreme poverty of the lower classes, yet they were still limited in their opportunities for social advancement. Marriage, while important, was not the only factor in their lives. However, their social standing was still tightly bound to the roles they were expected to fill. The middle-class woman, in particular, found herself in a position where the values of domesticity and social status were intricately tied together. While she could pursue education and some form of professional work, the societal expectation that she marry well and maintain her household remained a powerful force, limiting her ability to move freely in the world beyond the home. The role of the middle-class woman was often defined by a delicate balance between domestic responsibility and the emerging opportunities for self-expression. Women in this class were more likely to seek education or professional work, but even then, the options were limited. Teaching, nursing, and certain types of factory work were among the few professions that women could pursue. But even in these roles, the same societal pressures applied. Women who entered the workforce were still seen through the lens of their marital status and their ability to maintain their primary role as wife and mother. In this way, women of all social classes faced the same subtle yet inescapable barriers to true social mobility. The idea that a woman could shape her own path in the world was a foreign one, and the notion of self-actualization through career or independent achievement was one that did not fully take shape until much later. For Victorian wives, the path to success was not paved with personal ambition, but with the support of the man they married. As the years passed, the gradual shifts in society, the slow, sometimes imperceptible changes in the roles of women, did little to alleviate these restrictions. Women might gain the right to vote, or slowly gain access to education, but the true freedom that came with mobility, the ability to carve out one's own future, remained out of reach. These changes were significant, of course, and over time they contributed to the broader changes in women's rights. But in the Victorian world, social mobility for women was a distant hope, often obscured by the walls of tradition and expectation. In the end, the life of the Victorian wife was not one defined by visible oppression, but by the quiet constraints of a system that made it difficult, if not impossible, for a woman to move freely in the world. Her life, while full of small joys and responsibilities, was limited by a social structure that told her where she belonged, who she could be, and what she could do. These boundaries, though not always visible, were no less real, and though she moved through her days with grace, the walls that confined her were ever present, shaping every decision, every action, every thought. Looking back on the lives of these women, we see that their stories were not marked by grand moments of rebellion or triumph, but by small, quiet acts of survival. The barriers they faced were often invisible to the outside world, but they were no less real for those who lived within them. The life of the Victorian wife was not one of grand success or failure, but of a slow, gentle navigation through a world that had little space for her desires or ambitions. Yet, despite these constraints, many women managed to find moments of personal fulfillment even within the narrow spaces they were allowed. And in that, there was a quiet, enduring strength that persisted in the face of a world that sought to define them. In the quiet chambers of a Victorian home, where the passage of time was measured in the slow turning of the clock's hands, the life of a wife moved in a rhythm dictated not by her desires, but by the expectations placed upon her. The tasks of the day, preparing meals, tending to the children, and maintaining the household, filled her hours, but in the still moments between, there was often a quiet stirring of something more, something beyond the walls of the home. For many Victorian wives, the notion of rebellion was not one of defiance, but of quiet resistance. It was not the loud cry of revolution, but the soft murmur of an inner yearning. The space between their duties and their desires was vast, and within that space existed the tension between resignation and the fleeting hope for something more. It was not a matter of loud protest or dramatic change, but rather the delicate balancing act between duty and selfhood, between the life they were expected to lead and the lives they quietly dreamed of. The Victorian wife, despite her limitations, was not without moments of personal agency. It is important to acknowledge that even in a world defined by rigid boundaries, women found small ways to assert their autonomy. These acts were not grand gestures but quiet rebellions, often unnoticed by the world around them. A moment spent reading a book when the children were asleep, a painting left unfinished on an easel, or the private thoughts of a woman as she gazed out of a window. These were the spaces where women of the Victorian era could momentarily breathe outside of the expectations placed upon them. Yet these moments were fleeting, almost ephemeral. The structure of society was such that these small acts of rebellion were rarely allowed to flourish into something more. The woman, while she may have desired to carve out a space for herself outside the domestic sphere, found herself continually pulled back into the role society had defined for her. The expectation was simple and clear. A wife's place was at home, supporting her husband and raising the children. Any deviation from this was not only discouraged, but often met with quiet disapproval. There was no place for ambition outside the walls of the home, and so the rebellion, if it could be called such, was muffled by the weight of tradition. In this context, it is important to understand that resignation, too, was a form of survival. The idea of complete surrender to the domestic role was not always one of defeat, but of quiet acceptance. For many Victorian wives, the idea of personal ambition or independence was a foreign concept, one that could not be grasped within the confines of the life they had been given. They learned to adapt, to find meaning and purpose in the small tasks they performed each day. This resignation was not without its own form of quiet strength. The wife, in embracing her role, might have found a sense of pride in the care she gave her family. Her labour, though unpaid and unseen, was vital to the smooth running of the household. In a sense, she became the invisible backbone of society, holding together the fabric of the family and, by extension, the world around her. Her resignation was not necessarily born from a lack of desire, but from the acceptance of the life that had been set before her. She found purpose in the spaces between duty and desire, where her role as wife and mother intertwined with the quiet spaces of her own thoughts. At the same time, there were moments when this resignation was not enough. The small rebellions, those private acts of self-expression, could not fill the vast emptiness created by a life spent solely in service to others. And so, the tension between rebellion and resignation grew. The Victorian wife, though seemingly content with her role, could not escape the quiet desire for something more. It was a longing not for grandeur but for recognition, for the acknowledgement of her individuality outside the roles she had been assigned. For some women, this longing manifested in a search for education. The Victorian era saw a slow, gradual shift in the opportunities available to women, though these changes were not easily attained. For a woman to seek knowledge beyond the domestic realm was itself an act of quiet rebellion. She might have taken the opportunity to attend a private lesson or read a book in the solitude of her room, where her thoughts could drift beyond the walls of the home. These small steps were not enough to break free from the confines of societal expectations, but they marked the beginning of a shift, a recognition that a woman might have desires and ambitions beyond what was expected of her. In this act of seeking education, the Victorian wife was not only rebelling against her prescribed role, but also taking the first step towards self-actualization. The act of learning, of pursuing knowledge for its own sake, was itself a form of silent revolt. It was a declaration, however quiet, that a woman's life could be more than the sum of its domestic parts. But this rebellion, like all the others, was slow and gentle, unfolding in private moments and quiet reflections. The wife might have wished for a life of learning or creation, but the pace of change was such that it would take decades for such desires to be realized on a larger scale. Yet, even as she sought small moments of rebellion, the Victorian wife was often pulled back into the role that had been assigned to her. The demands of the household, the needs of the children, the expectations of her husband, all these were constant forces that exerted pressure on her time and energy. The small rebellions, the quiet moments of personal ambition, were often sacrificed to the demands of duty. And so the tension between rebellion and resignation grew, like a gentle pull between two forces, neither of which could fully dominate. This cycle of rebellion and resignation was not just an individual struggle, but a collective one. It was the struggle of women who, despite their best efforts, found themselves limited by a system that did not allow them to fully express themselves. The world outside the domestic sphere was not open to them, and the small rebellions they attempted were often thwarted by the weight of societal expectations. The Victorian wife, despite her intelligence, her creativity, and her ambition, was bound by the unspoken rules of her world. Her life, though rich in its own way, was confined by the walls of tradition, and her rebellion, gentle though it was, could never fully break free of those confines. As history unfolds, we see that the small rebellions of the Victorian wife were not without consequence. Though they did not result in immediate change, they marked the beginning of a shift in the way women would come to view their roles in society. Over time, as education became more accessible and opportunities for women slowly expanded, these quiet revolts paved the way for larger movements toward gender equality. Looking back on the life of the Victorian wife, we understand that her rebellion was not one of loud protest, but of quiet resistance. It was not the bold rejection of societal norms, but the subtle assertion of individuality within a world that offered few opportunities for such expression. Her resignation was not defeat, but survival, a recognition that the life she led was shaped by forces beyond her control. Yet in her quiet rebellion, she planted the seeds for future generations of women who would eventually find the courage to challenge the system that had kept them confined for so long. The Victorian wife, though resigned to her fate, was never truly silent. Her thoughts, her desires, her small acts of rebellion, these are the quiet whispers of change that echo through history, reminding us of the strength that lies in the silence between the expectations placed upon us and the desires we quietly hold. As we close the pages of history and turn back toward our present, the quiet story of the Victorian wife lingers in the spaces between words, like a soft echo that refuses to fade. In this story, there are no grand conclusions, no sudden bursts of change, but rather a slow unfolding of time, where the seeds of resistance and hope were planted in the smallest of acts. The lives of Victorian wives, constrained by the invisible walls of society, offer us a glimpse into a world that seems distant, yet whose echoes can still be felt today. The struggles they faced, the quiet battles against economic dependence, the gentle rebellion against social mobility, and the soft tension between resignation and personal desire, were not the loud protests of history, but the silent whispers that have shaped the world we now inhabit. As we reflect on this time, we do not look back with anger or frustration, but with a quiet understanding of the forces that shaped these women's lives. Their stories are not ones of dramatic struggle, but of subtle endurance. The small acts of defiance, the quiet desires for education, for a life beyond the walls of the home, were the sparks of change. These sparks, though often fleeting and unacknowledged, carried the potential for something more, something different. In these acts, we see the slow, persistent push toward a more equitable world, even if that world was not fully realized in the time they lived. In reflecting on their lives, we begin to understand that the struggles of Victorian wives were not the struggles of individuals, but of an entire system. They were not the result of personal failure or weakness, but the result of a society that had structured its entire foundation on inequality. The limits placed on women were not born of their abilities, but of the rules that governed their world. These women, though bound by the expectations of their time, found ways to exist within these boundaries, and in doing so, they paved the way for those who would come after them. The struggle of the Victorian wife was not one of resistance in the traditional sense, but of quiet survival. It was a life lived in the spaces between duty and desire, where personal dreams were often set aside for the needs of the family and the expectations of society. And yet, even in this quiet existence, there was a strength, a resilience that would be passed down through generations. The world these women lived in was one of limited possibilities, but it was also one in which small acts of rebellion were possible. Their struggle, though invisible to many at the time, has become a quiet foundation for the world we now recognize as the fight for gender equality. As we reflect on their lives, we recognize that the struggle continues, not just in the distant past, but in the present as well. The world of the Victorian wife is no longer our world, but the questions they faced, the limits placed on their lives, the subtle tensions between freedom and restraint, are questions we still grapple with today. The fight for equality, for opportunity, and for recognition continues, even as the shape of that fight changes over time. In the end, the story of the Victorian wife is one of quiet perseverance. It is not a story of victory, but a story of survival, of finding meaning in the roles that society gave them, even as they longed for something more. It is a reminder that progress is often slow, and that change often comes not in grand gestures, but in the quiet, persistent push of small acts over time. And as we move forward, we carry with us the echoes of their lives, gently reminding us of the quiet struggles that have shaped our present and continue to shape our future. Thank you for joining us. Rest well, take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time, good night.